An educator from my youth addressed my high school and simplified people into three categories: those who create problems, those who are immobilized by problems, and those who solve problems. The last 45 years have proven that there are three major categories of political ideologies in America that serve as intellectual umbrellas for more specific ideologies, such as fascism and socialism. Conservatism creates problems. Neoliberalism is immobilized by problems. And progressivism solves problems. Or at least progressives would solve problems if we ever actually acquired real power. Since 1980, conservative economic policy instilled in the American public the cultural assumption that tax cuts, deregulation, and minimizing government, save the military of course, are legitimate methods for catalyzing economic growth, the benefits of which are supposed to be distributed among the people en masse, but never are. Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump all prioritized the performance of the stock market over the interests of the American public, indicative of America's wealth gap and income inequality problems. Did you know that the top 10% of households own well over 90% of publicly traded stock? For an inverse perspective, the bottom 50% of American households own roughly 2.5% of all wealth in America. These are just two of the basic statistics any progressive can use to prove that conservative capitalism does not produce an equal opportunity society. Financially speaking, the American dream does not manifest in a high-paying job so much as it does in the investing opportunities that come from years of having income that produces savings, which are then invested over time to yield returns. Put more simply, the American dream since 1980 has devolved from living a life of purpose to living off the returns of your investments so that you don't have to work anymore. A legendary Oliver Stone film about the financial giants that played the stock market in the 80s by the name of Wall Street not so subtly criticizes the devastating cultural assumption that Reaganomics endowed America with over the course of the last 45 years. Greed is good. The saddest part of my three categories of American political ideologies is that two out of the three reinforce the greed is good cultural assumption, one explicitly and the other implicitly. While Republicans have unapologetically pursued tax cuts and deregulation with their political power, so too have Democrats since Bill Clinton transformed the party of structural change into the party of neoliberal incrementalism, which politically amounts to nothing more than conservative capitulation. When Bill Clinton publicly pronounced the era of big government is over, he conceded the intellectual high ground that the Democratic Party still had a chance to hold. That conservative capitalism does not produce an equitable economy. Thus, the government should and must make changes to the system to make the system more equitable. With respect to the false binary that is the question of whether or not government is the solution to citizens' problems or the source of citizens' problems, Bill Clinton let America forget the legacy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal Democratic Party Any reasonable person who knows both their American history and has reasonable comprehension of problem solving can tell you that the presence of government in society is not a question of big versus small, but rather effective versus ineffective. By proclaiming the era of big government is over, Bill Clinton conceded ideological holy ground that banished the lovable ghost of FDR from Washington and allowed the ghost of Reagan to haunt the halls of the district for 30 years and counting. Bill Clinton personifies the dichotomy of public memory versus history. According to public memory, Clinton was a sleazy guy, but an effective president. Even Bernie Sanders is on public record calling Bill Clinton an overall good president. That was during the 2016 primaries, however, so I think Bernie was probably accommodating the memory of Clinton as opposed to the history of Clinton. Because according to history, Bill Clinton's policies devastated not just the Democratic Party's ideological foundation, but the foundations of America's economy, culture, and society established under the New Deal. Trade, banking, criminal justice, welfare, and the Fourth Estate were all transformed under Clinton, and not for the better. History has proven that Clinton's North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, would lead to outsourcing, taking away millions of good middle-class jobs over the decades. Clinton's repeal of the New Deal's Glass-Steagall legislation allowed retail banks to merge with and become investment banks. The consolidation of financial institutions that would ensue exacerbated wealth inequality and produced the Great Recession of 2008. Clinton's racist crime bill devastated poor communities of color and gave way to law enforcement's culture of urban warfare, the militarization of our local police. The list of Clinton's failures doesn't end there. Clinton's welfare to work reform came from Newt Gingrich's Congress and hurt millions of poor families, both urban and rural. Finally, my personal favorite, Bill Clinton's 1996 Telecommunications Act allowed for historic levels of consolidation in media, and it transformed the public good that was news into the for-profit entertainment business news has become today. 2016 brought about the greatest internal conflict the Democratic Party had seen since Ted Kennedy challenged Jimmy Carter, a sitting president, in 1980. The 2016 Democratic Party primary race between Hillary and Bernie would take establishment versus anti-establishment to a whole new level of cultural relevance. In case you've forgotten, the DNC establishment gave Hillary every advantage they could, while Bernie tried to transform the party by focusing on big-time policies such as Medicare for all, free college, and raising the minimum wage. Without revisiting history that you can Google on your own, let's just say that that race came down to the DNC establishment telling everyone on the left it's Hillary's turn, while progressives cared anew about Bill Clinton's legendary policy failures that I just listed. And they didn't want to revisit that style of government. Hillary versus Bernie in 2016, and to a lesser extent, Biden versus Bernie in 2020, exposed the vast ideological gap that exists on the left between baby boomer Democrats who think capitalism can work and younger progressives who are starting to pay more attention to politics, only to realize that the baby boomer politicians copped out of their responsibility to improve America generation to generation. Instead, they sacrificed our futures at the altar of the deregulated free market, taking as much as they could for themselves, only to leave us holding a bag of debt. Before Bill Clinton, liberal just meant Democrat. Since Bill Clinton, liberal still means Democrat, but what it actually means ideologically is neoliberal. The original liberalism that defined the post-war left no longer exists. On the left today, there is neoliberal, which is the capitalist establishment featuring personalities such as Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and Hakeem Jeffries. And then there is the progressive left, which is the anti-establishment, featuring only a handful of names such as Bernie, AOC, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and a few others. Underneath the label progressive, there are several subdivisions of the left, such as socialists, social democrats, and I will discuss those in a future episode. Sometimes leaders work better than labels when attempting to describe the effect a certain political ideology would have on a society. If you want to simplify the umbrella label of progressive by utilizing a particularly popular figure, progressives love Zoran Mamdani. The failure that has been neoliberalism may have started with Bill Clinton, but it continued under Barack Obama. Because of the miserable end to W's second term, Obama came into the White House with more power than any Democrat had since the 60s. Democrats not only had the White House, they had both houses of Congress, and a political wave of momentum, the likes of which the country hadn't seen since Reagan won all but Minnesota in 1984. What did the Illinois native, who had served as a senator for exactly 25 months before announcing his run for president, do with this historical level of political power? Barack Obama let Joe Lieberman and Rahm Emanuel talk him out of putting a public option into Obama's landmark legislation, the Affordable Care Act, which is something the progressive left has been begging for since FDR's Second Bill of Rights. Obama's Affordable Care Act is the definition of neoliberal incrementalism. Rather than make healthcare a right by transforming the structure of our healthcare system and give Democrats an historic political win, Obama delivered moderate change that made the pain of a for-profit healthcare system not hurt as much. But the pain remained. Sure, Obamacare made things marginally better, especially for people with pre-existing conditions, but it still catered to the establishment of power within the healthcare industry in America, the health insurance and pharmaceutical companies. When asked years later about why he didn't push for universal health care when he had that historic level of political power, Obama said the nation wasn't ready for universal health care. That is quintessential consumer politics. That is the antithesis of leadership. And what's more is that it's a loser mentality. First of all, if someone you care about isn't ready for something, what do? You make them ready, right? See, that's a winner's attitude toward change. Way better than waiting for the circumstances to be perfect. Secondly, his excuse for why he missed the political opportunity of a generation amounts to nothing more than the concerns he had about getting universal health care through Congress. He could have used his superstar status at the time to work Congress rather than getting worked by Congress. People forget just how much popularity Obama had at that time. He didn't use it because he's just so nice of a guy, preoccupied with getting everyone to like him rather than respect him. Clinton's deconstruction of the Democratic Party's ideology was followed by Obama's missed political opportunity, which was followed most recently by Biden's mishandling of power. With respect to the debatably good things they did while in office, all three Democratic presidents of the last 45 years have been defined by neoliberal incrementalism. If you're still wondering at this point whether or not neoliberal incrementalism can work, I have an answer for you. No. Neoliberalism doesn't work because neoliberalism is just another form of capitalism, and all forms of capitalism fail to reconcile wealth, income, and social inequality. Neoliberalism doesn't admit that American capitalism as we know it today has failed miserably and cannot be salvaged. Incrementalism has been a problem for the country since the Civil Rights Movement. Incrementalism also runs counter to our cultural norms. Since when do Americans do anything well when they do it smaller than they should? We are a nation of big timers. We are a nation that does big things well. So the results of all that work last lifetimes. Why is it that when it comes to politics today, rhetoric almost always originates with what we can't expect from our government and society as a whole? That's weak. That's lazy. That's anti-American. Let's use the easiest and most relatable issue in all of politics to introduce what progressive pragmatism could do for America. Healthcare. The response to Medicare for all or something better shouldn't be, how are we going to pay for it, or we can't afford it. Given that universal healthcare polls at roughly 70% and has for many years, the response from politicians should be, we can't afford not to do universal healthcare, and we should do it as soon as possible because people are going bankrupt due to medical debt, and that doesn't happen in other developed nations. Here's the tragic reality of healthcare in America. Because of campaign financing, healthcare companies still run the healthcare industry. Both parties are beholden to that industry, and no one in that industry wants there to be universal healthcare. So unless we see some serious ideological change within Democratic Party leadership, it's safe to say universal healthcare in America probably isn't happening until the 2030s. Unless, of course, you, your friends, your neighbors, and 80 to 90% of voters in urban and suburban areas start showing up for both primary and general elections. Stay tuned to hear how we make that happen. And never forget, you don't get change in America by asking nicely.